Former U.S. President Donald Trump survived an assassination attempt over the weekend at a rally in Pennsylvania. Investigations into the motive of the shooter continue. Strong global demand drove the country's tech exports up by 31% in June. Israeli airstrikes continue in Gaza, with the most recent one hitting a school, killing at least 17, including children. It's likely to further complicate ongoing ceasefire talks. It's July 15th, 6 p.m. in Seoul. This is Newscenter. Thank you for joining us. I'm Yoon. We start over in the U.S., where a shocking assassination attempt against former President Trump occurred over the weekend. An investigation is underway into the gunman who the FBI says acted alone. Shin Ha-young has the details.
The U.S. Secret Service is investigating the circumstances surrounding an assassination attempt on former President Donald Trump during a rally in Pennsylvania on Saturday local time. Authorities identified the gunman who attacked Trump as Thomas Matthew Crooks, a 20-year-old man from Pittsburgh. CNN reported that Crooks fired at Trump from a building rooftop outside the rally's security perimeter before he was killed by the Secret Service. The FBI says he acted alone using an AR-style rifle believed to have been bought by his father, and there are currently no public safety concerns. According to the New York Times, Crooks came from a typical middle-class background with mixed political views. He was registered as a Republican while his mother was a Democrat and his father a Libertarian. In a primetime national address from the Oval Office on Sunday, U.S. President Joe Biden warned of the risks of political violence in the U.S., saying it's time to cool it down.
My fellow Americans, I want to speak to you tonight about the need for us to lower the temperature in our politics. And to remember, while we may disagree, we are not enemies. You know, the political record in this country has gotten very heated. It's time to cool it down.
Earlier Sunday, Biden condemned the attempted assassination of Trump, calling for the nation to come together as one and announcing an independent security review to investigate how the attack occurred. Trump's aide said he was in great spirits and doing well after the shooting, which resulted in an injury to his right ear. According to the Butler County District Attorney, one spectator at the rally died in the shooting while another is in a serious condition. Trump took to social media some 13 hours after the shooting to thank those who prayed for him and urged Americans to stand united and show their true character as Americans. Trump also stated he would stick to his schedule despite the shooting. He arrived in Milwaukee on Sunday for the Republican National Convention, where he is set to be named the party's presidential nominee later this week. Shin Ha-young, Arirang News.
Now, this shocking incident is bringing up talks about political polarization, leading to acts of violence. Our Lee Shi-hu shares the voices of experts and politicians who say that it's time to put a stop to hate politics.
Throughout history, the U.S. has suffered many attempted assassinations of its political figures. 4 of its presidents were assassinated while in office, including Abraham Lincoln in 1865 and John F. Kennedy in 1963. More presidents, including Ronald Reagan and Theodore Roosevelt, survived assassination attempts. And with the recent attack on Donald Trump, an expert on politics and security points to the support for political violence in the mainstream as the driving force of such violence.
What we're seeing is accepting political violence in the mainstream, and then, no surprise, some volatile actors are acting out, and then we say, oh my gosh, how could that possibly happen?
Pape stresses the need for political cohesion to redirect public support from violence toward voting.
We're now at a tipping point. There is a potential for this whole thing to spiral now that we've passed this threshold, and this is the time to come together against political violence.
The problem isn't that of the U.S. alone. In 2022, the former Prime Minister of Japan, Shinzo Abe, was shot and killed. Following Saturday's attack on Trump, South Korea's political circle, which too has experienced acts of violence in recent months, spoke out against these. Both the ruling People Power Party and the main opposition Democratic Party of Korea vowed in unison to take the lead in eradicating extreme and hate politics. 이시후, Arirang News.
Shifting gears, Korea's tech exports jumped over 31% in June, bolstered by semiconductor shipments overseas. Lee Soo-jin has the latest trade numbers.
Semiconductors once again led the increase in South Korea's tech exports last month. Data released by the Trade Ministry on Monday shows that ICT exports in June reached $21 billion. That's an increase of 31.1% compared to the same time the previous year. It's also the largest ever recorded for the month of June and the third straight month that tech exports have seen an on-year increase of more than 30%. This was driven by outbound shipments of chips also reaching a record high last month. Chip exports surpassed a previous record set in March 2022 on the back of growth in the AI market and a recovery in the sales of IT devices. Memory chip exports were especially high thanks to the increased demand for high-value products like high-bandwidth memory chips. As for other tech exports, display saw double-digit export growth for the fifth consecutive month, and computers also saw a rise for the sixth straight month. By country, South Korea's exports to China, the nation's biggest destination for ICT exports, saw an on-year increase for the eighth consecutive month in June. Shipments to other nations such as the United States and the European Union also rose, but there was a slump in exports to Japan. Meanwhile, ICT imports last month dropped 5.1% on year due to fewer inbound shipments of chips and rechargeable batteries. As for the first half of the year, ICT exports rose 28.2% to $109 billion, the second largest amount of exports on a six-month basis. This was also driven by outbound shipments of chips rising nearly 50% on year on the back of strong demand. During the January to June period, other tech exports such as displays and computers saw a double-digit increase compared to the previous year. And exports to China during this period rose more than 37% on year. Imports, on the other hand, fell on year, leading to a trade surplus of $41 billion. Lee Soo-jin, Arirang News.
China's economy slowed in the second quarter, missing growth estimates due to weak domestic demand. Data from Beijing's National Bureau of Statistics on Monday showed that the country's GDP in the second quarter of the year rose 4.7% year-on-year. This is lower than the 5.1% growth predicted by analysts in a Reuters poll and the 5.3% expansion seen in the previous quarter. Retail sales rose by 2%, below the forecast of 3.3%, putting pressure on policymakers to boost the market as they start China's high-level policy meeting, the third plenum, on Monday. The domestically developed Bigung guided missile has successfully passed the final test conducted by the Pentagon, raising hopes for South Korea's first-ever arms deal with the U.S. Our defense correspondent Jeong reports.
South Korea's Bigung Poniard guided rocket system has passed the final test needed for potential use in the U.S. The weapon, developed by defense company LIG Next One in cooperation with the Agency for Defense Development, was test-fired in waters off Hawaii last Friday on the sidelines of the Rim of the Pacific maritime exercise. LIG Next One announced Monday that the Bigungs successfully hit all 6 targets. Friday's test was the last in a series of successful evaluations conducted by the U.S. Defense Department over the past 5 years. It has shown a 100% hit rate in all foreign comparative tests aimed at evaluating whether foreign weapons satisfy valid defense requirements for use in the U.S. The Bigung is a 70mm low-cost guided imaging rocket that can be fired from land, sea, and air. It's known for its cost-effectiveness and ability to accurately hit multiple targets at once. Friday's success marks a significant milestone as it would open the door for exports, representing the first time a complete South Korean-made weapon system is integrated into Washington's arsenal.
Exports would come following a budget approval by the US Congress and a contract procedure after the test launch. We are working on this in many ways.
A day before the launch, the U.S. Chief of Naval Operations Admiral Lisa Franchetti visited the South Korean Navy's vessel, the Cheonjabong, where the test launch took place, to take a closer look at the weapon. She said the launch test of Bigung during RIMPAC 2024 marks another advancement in integrating unmanned systems into U.S. naval operations. Commander of U.S. Indo-Pacific Command Samuel Paparo also showed great interest in the South Korean weapon.
If we're not curious about each other's capabilities, we do each other a tremendous disservice. So of course, I'm interested in this. And if we could find ways to build it either on license from each other, or we find ways to build it on export from each other, if it works and if it's good and if it benefits our alliance, we should do it.
Following the successful test results, South Korea would now have to see if it could clinch its first ever defense export deal with the U.S. Jeong, Arirang News.
In the Middle East, Israeli airstrikes continued in Gaza over the weekend, with the most recent one hitting a school, killing more civilians, including children. Yoon explains.
On Sunday, another school in the Nusayrat refugee camp in central Gaza was struck by Israeli airstrikes. At least 17 people, mostly women and children, were killed, and 80 were wounded in the strike on the UN-run Abu Araban school, which Gaza Civil Defence Agency says was housing thousands of displaced people. The Israeli military said the operation was against terrorists, who triggered the start of the war with their attack on Israel on October 7th. This is the fifth attack on a school since July 6th, with Israel saying that Hamas uses schools, hospitals, and other public infrastructure for military purposes, which Hamas denies. It also follows Israeli attacks on Saturday night on the Al-Mawasi refugee camp in Khan Yunis that killed at least 90 people and injured hundreds. The Israeli military claimed that the target of their attack on Saturday was Hamas commander Mohammed Deif and the commander of the Khan Yunis brigade Rafah Salameh. Israel has accused both of masterminding the Hamas-led October 7th attack on southern Israel. But with no confirmation of whether the targets were struck, Hamas says only defenseless civilians were killed. The Al-Mawasi attack on a designated humanitarian safe zone in Gaza was condemned by the United Nations and countries across the Middle East. Egypt, among mediators working toward a ceasefire deal, said that the ongoing violations would only add serious complications to reaching an agreement. Meanwhile, the United Nations says the attacks may have breached international law, adding to a UN report from March that Israel may be committing genocide in Gaza. Yoon, Arirang News.
Back in this country, the National Forensic Service informed the police that the tragic car accident near Seoul City Hall on July 1st, which killed 9 pedestrians, was likely the driver's fault. On Monday, police authorities announced that they had completed their analysis of the NFS report, and their investigation into the actual cause of the accident was almost finished. The report stated that the 68-year-old driver pressed the accelerator pedal to more than 90% of its capacity, according to the car's event data recorder. The police plan to question the driver again later. He has insisted that the brakes on the car failed to work, causing a sudden unintended acceleration. This past Sunday, South Korea observed its first celebration of a special day designated to better accommodate North Koreans who chose to cross the border into the South in search of freedom. Kim Do-yeon has more.
Tears and emotions filled the room as songs and messages celebrated the courage of North Korean defectors and their journey escaping North Korea, as well as giving encouragement to overcome their struggles and adapt to a new life in South Korea. Sunday was the first ever North Korean Defectors Day, with the main celebration at the former presidential Blue House. President Yoon, who signed the law to designate July 14th as a day celebrating defectors, promised to take care of those who came seeking freedom as he hosted around 200 North Korean defectors.
우리 정부는 자유를 향한 여러분의 발걸음이 헛되지 않도록 하겠습니다. 대한민국을 찾는 북한 동포를 어떠한 일이 있더라도 단 한 분도 돌려보내지 않을 것입니다.
He also condemned North Korea's human rights violations, referring to the first of its kind government publication, the report on North Korean human rights from last year, and said resolving this issue will be the foundation of the unification. And taking care of the defectors is the beginning, with around 34,000 North Korean defectors currently in South Korea.
탈북민 여러분을 포용하는 것이 북한 인권을 개선하는 첫 걸음이 될 것입니다. 저는 오늘 대한민국이 여러분께 희망의 보금자리가 될 수 있도록 정착, 역량, 화합의 세 가지 약속을 드리고자 합니다.
In terms of settlement, President Yoon vowed to improve the settlement support fund and help defectors with supported savings accounts. For capability, the government will provide them with more employment opportunities with benefits for companies that hire defectors. And finally, harmony. The government is looking to tackle discrimination while offering mentoring programs with already arrived defectors helping newcomers. Yoon also re-emphasized that as North Korea are South Korean citizens, protecting them is essential for achieving true unification. In the meantime, people outside of South Korea also joined in with messages of encouragement.
We have had the privilege of meeting a few North Korean defectors and
some of the strongest people in the world, strongest and most courageous people in the world. And we're really proud of you and just want to encourage you to follow your dreams.
In the meantime, President Yoon also met with the Little League Baseball team of young North Korean defectors, the Challengers, to send them off for a trip to the U.S. President Yoon congratulated them on their journey to the birthplace of baseball, the United States, as future national team players of a free and unified Korea. Kim Do-yeon, Arirang News.
President Yoon has appointed veteran news anchor and journalist Jeong HeyJeon as his new spokesperson in a mini reshuffle. The top office announced the new appointment as a replacement for Kim Soo-kyung, who has been instated as the Vice Minister of Unification. Jeong promises to communicate with the press in a personal and articulate manner, having joined the Yoon administration's Public Relations and Planning Office last year.
I believe it is my foremost task to engage with the media to effectively communicate with the public. As spokesperson, I will reach out to you first on a regular basis to explain in detail the philosophy and progress of our administration's tasks.
Jeong has worked as a reporter for Korean dailies, including 세계일보 and 조선일보, and was the news anchor of TV Chosun. Having received her postgraduate degree in public administration at Harvard Kennedy School, she has directed communications and strategy for private firms such as McKinsey. Yoon's office says it expects Jeong to be an outstanding communication partner for members of the media based on her wealth of experience. Time now to take a look at what's been happening in the world of sports. Joining us in the studio is our sports editor, Paul Need. Hi, Paul.
Hello there.
Let's begin with football and the men's Euros, another title for Spain.
Yes, a fourth Euros win for Spain. They beat England 2-1 in Sunday's final in Berlin, thanks to a late goal from Mikel Oyarzabal. Cole Palmer had levelled for England on 73 minutes, cancelling out Nico Williams' opener just after the restart. But it was England's second Euros final defeat in a row and Spain's fourth title overall at first since 2012. Spain actually won all 7 of their matches without needing penalty shootouts, and that is a Euros record. They also beat every other European nation along the way that has won a World Cup. Meanwhile, in the Copa America in the United States, Argentina beat Colombia 1-0 in Sunday's final in Miami. Lautaro Martinez scored the game's only goal in the second half of extra time. It's Argentina's 16th Copa America and third major trophy in a row, having won the Copa America in 2021 and the World Cup in Qatar in 2022.
And with just over 10 days left until the Olympic Games in Paris, the Olympic torch relay arrived in the French capital on Sunday.
Yes, after 2 months of being around France and its overseas territories as well, French former footballer and the current coach of the French Olympic squad, Thierry Henry, kicked off the relay for the first leg on the famed Champs-Élysées Avenue. The flame also passed other famous landmarks such as the Arc de Triomphe, the Grand Palais, and finally the Louvre. Jin from BTS became the first torchbearer at the Louvre section and was greeted by screaming fans. The 2024 Paris Olympics run from July 26th to August the 11th, while the Paralympic Games will follow from August 28th to September the 8th.
And moving on to golf now. South Korea's Im Sung-jae finished fourth at the Scottish Open. What can you tell us?
Well, that was his sixth top 10 finish of the season. And at the Renaissance Club in North Berwick, Im finished at 14 under par, along with 5 others, including Rory McIlroy. Im birdied in the last hole for a closing 1 under 69. He's had to overcome the disappointment of missing all 3 cuts in the majors this season. But his 6th top 10 of the season gives him confidence heading into the Open Championship next week. Meanwhile, Scotland's Robert McIntyre won on home soil, finishing at 18 under par.
And finally, to tennis and Wimbledon, an emphatic victory for Carlos Alcaraz in the men's final.
Yes, that's right. He beat Novak Djokovic in straight sets on centre court on Sunday, 6-2, 6-2, 7-6, 7-4. He retains his title following what was a repeat of last year's final. The win also means that the Spaniard continues his 100% record in Grand Slam finals. At 21, he is also the youngest man to win Wimbledon and the French Open in the same year. In the women's final on Sunday, Barbora Krejcikova beat Yasmin Paolini in an enthralling encounter, 6-2, 2-6, 6-4. It's her first win at Wimbledon and second Grand Slam, having won the French Open in 2021.
All right, thank you for the report. See you next week.
Thank you. See you.
Today's Chobok, which marks the beginning of the midsummer heat. In line with this, a heat wave warning is issued in Seoul, following the Seoul metropolitan area, where there have been heat wave warnings for several days. Warnings have also been issued in some parts of Jeollado provinces. Tomorrow there will be heavy rain all over the country. Up to 80 millimeters will fall around the southern coast tomorrow, and Jeju Island is expected to see 5 to 30. The Seoul metropolitan area and Gangwon-do province will have up to 100 millimeters of monsoon rain, 30 to 80 in Chungcheongnam-do province. Tomorrow, Seoul and Gwangju will start off at 24 degrees Celsius. Highs will move up to 30 in Seoul, Chuncheon, and Daejeon. Gwangju, Daegu, and Gyeongju, 29 degrees. Rainy conditions will continue throughout the week. That's all for Korea. Here are the weather conditions around the world.
That is Newscenter for tonight. Thank you for watching. A panel session coming up.
Completely new. But something anyone can relate with. Flawlessly made. And tears that go with it. K-drama. Korea is coming at you with another story to tell. Children's. Laughter. Hope. Dream. K-animation belongs in them. Interesting and valuable story that transcends between everyday life and dream. Surprising spectacle where imagination becomes real. An array of subjects catering from infants to adolescents. For our story to reach all corners of the world. K-animation makes healthy laughter for children.
Thanks for tuning in to Within the Frame. Coming to you live from Seoul, I'm Han Dan. This year's NATO summit captured global attention for many reasons, one of them being the alliance's blunt warnings against Russia, North Korea, and China. It condemned the growing military cooperation between North Korea and Russia, and for the first time officially criticized China's alleged support for Russia in the Ukraine war. The Western alliance also expanded its partnerships with Indo-Pacific nations, including South Korea, as it looks to counter China's perceived threat in the region. How will the summit results impact the already vivid divide between nations that share democratic values and those that don't? What impact will they have on South Korea's relations with regional players? For some clues, we turn to Professor Jeong HeyJeon from Jeong University's Department of Political Science. Thank you for coming in today.
Thank you for having me.
And also joining us tonight is Professor Brian Myers from Dongsa University. It's always a great pleasure to have you with us.
It's always great to be here.
All right, Professor Che, let's start with you. So this was President Yoon's third NATO summit. What would you pick as his diplomatic achievements?
Yes, for the past 3 years, as you said, President Yoon has made his presence felt at the NATO summit. And I think, his presence for these 3 years showed South Korea's very important role as a global pivotal state on the world stage. And during this summit, he pointed out that the war in Ukraine is not just a problem for Europe anymore. It's now a direct threat to South Korea too, especially after the recent military cooperation pact between Pyongyang and Moscow. And this pact could not only prolong the war in Ukraine, but also increase the nuclear threat from North Korea and creating a global security concern. And that's why President Yoon Suk-yeol held meetings with the leaders of 12 nations during this event, including leaders from the United States and also Japan. He took this chance to make stronger ties with these countries to put more pressure on Russia and also North Korea. So as a result of this effort, NATO included a special section in the Washington Summit Declaration expressing grave concern about the military cooperation between Russia and North Korea. And moreover, the President Yoon Suk-yeol and the United States signed a joint statement on the guidelines for nuclear operation. So this agreement effectively guarantees the U.S. nuclear assets will be stationed on the Korean Peninsula in times of both war and peace. This can greatly increase South Korea's security. And finally, I'd like to also mention the presence of the Indo-Pacific Quadrilateral Partnership, or IP4, at the NATO summit. This IP4 includes South Korea, Japan, Australia, and New Zealand. So starting in 2022, IP4 leaders have joined the NATO summit for 3 consecutive years. And this could lead to the formal inclusion of the IP4, extending NATO's influence from the North Atlantic all the way to the Indo-Pacific.
I'm glad that you highlighted the fact that the war in Ukraine is no longer a security concern for Europe, but also for South Korea as well, especially after the signing of North Korea-Russia military pact. And this as Russia could transfer advanced missile technologies to North Korea, which could have irreversible impact on the Korean Peninsula. Professor Myers, North Korea has condemned the NATO summit declaration, labeling it an quote-unquote illegal document. It said that the declaration incites a new Cold War and military confrontation on a global scale. What is North Korea most wary of?
Well, we're used to very strong rhetoric from North Korea, but I think the NATO summit declaration really does worry the Kim Jong-un regime to a certain extent. Most NATO summits are pretty routine affirmations of solidarity and resolve. But this one had a special urgency to it because, as Professor Che was saying, it was all about strengthening defense capabilities in the face of a perceived threat from Russia. Now, that looks to us like a very sober response to the Ukraine war, but it may well look threatening to Pyongyang, especially in view of NATO attacks on Serbia and Libya over the past quarter century. Now, since the end of the Korean War, North Korea has seen its main enemies as, let's say, the US, South Korea, and Japan, in that order, all Pacific Ocean countries. So to be targeted in a very strong statement from NATO is probably unsettling in itself. But I think what Kim Jong-un is most wary of is that this Ukraine conflict could boil over in any number of ways, and it could draw Western Europe and the United States so deeply into it that NATO begins to regard some form of outright hostility against North Korea as necessary.
Well, North Korea, in response, also said that it will need, quote unquote, a new force and mode of counteraction against the NATO declaration. We'll see if it's just another bluffing or not. And Dr. Myers, President Yoon held a sideline summit with U.S. President Biden where they signed South Korea-U.S. nuclear deterrence guidelines, warning that any North Korean nuclear attack against South Korea will be met with a swift, overwhelming, and decisive response. How significant is this? And do you believe the newly signed guidelines will substantially raise the allies' deterrence against North Korea's nuclear threats?
Yeah, it's always hard to say because the actual substance of these agreements, what they mean in concrete military terms, is always kept secret for understandable reasons. But from the reports that I've seen, it doesn't really look like a substantial upgrade or strengthening of the so-called Washington Declaration that President Yoon and Biden signed in April last year. Yes, America will respond decisively and overwhelmingly to any North Korean nuclear attack on South Korea. But what exactly does that mean? This declaration does come with an explicit commitment to assigning U.S. nuclear assets to the alliance's missions, but that's not the same thing as promising nuclear retaliation against a nuclear attack on South Korea. So the Americans are still refusing to box themselves in that way. And that worries Seoul a bit. Now, I don't want to be over hasty again, but without knowing concretely how this agreement is going to alter military matters, I'm left with the impression that it's really about stilling the South Korean public's growing desire for an independent nuclear deterrent. We had that opinion poll a while back, which showed a majority of people here want a deterrent, and that really struck home in Washington. So I think the Americans are doing all they can with these shows of close partnership. And no doubt we down here in Busan are going to be getting more U.S. aircraft carrier visits. But whether this keeps the South Korean public happy is another matter. Honestly, I don't think it will.
Well, South Korea's presidential office said Seoul and Washington will carry out joint military drills to help implement the newly announced guidelines, which will see the deployment of U.S. nuclear assets on the Korean peninsula. But as you pointed out, the concrete details are still under the wraps, and it remains to be seen if it'll be enough to quell South Korea's growing calls to acquire its own nuclear weapons. Professor Che, Russia's foreign ministry expressed regret over what it called South Korea's NATO-style intimidation and threats of its aid to Ukraine. President Putin, meanwhile, said Moscow will respond in a way that'll be painful for Seoul. How would Seoul-Moscow relations play out from here?
Okay, so the recent harsh statements from Russia show a serious strain in the bilateral relationship between Seoul and Moscow. And the tough language from Russia indicates that tensions could grow even more in the future. So, as you said, Russia has warned of consequences for Seoul that could be painful. So, if South Korea provides, for example, lethal weapons to Ukraine, so this could mean some economic sanctions or reduced cooperation between the two countries, especially in areas like trade and investment. So while it's very difficult to fully restore this relationship, as long as Russia keeps up their military cooperation with North Korea, but we cannot just ignore this bilateral relationship. So we have to handle this relationship with Russia very wisely, because Russia plays a significant role in the Korean peninsula, affecting both our security and also economy. And we also need to look out for our citizens and business operating in Russia. So it's important to keep the communication alliances with Russia open at the necessary level. However, As the war in Ukraine drags on and the military ties between Russia and North Korea continue, restoring this relationship will be very challenging. So I believe that our action toward Russia will depend on their future moves. So if they take steps that actually threaten our security, for example, providing advanced military technology or weapons to North Korea, we must act strongly against Russia. But at the same time, we should avoid escalating the situation by sending lethal weapons to Ukraine first. Okay. So ultimately, the future of our relationship with Russia is in their hands.
Well, the growing North Korea-Russia military ties may be threatening, but Russia's significant roles can't also be overlooked. Now, Professor Myers, for the first time, NATO has officially slammed China as the quote-unquote decisive enabler of Russia's war in Ukraine. China was quick to react, saying NATO was smearing China with fabricated disinformation. Do you foresee stronger China, Russia, North Korea alignment in light of the West's blunt criticism?
I do, actually, and I think it's unfortunate. You know, a French nobleman once said that if somebody is standing directly between you, right in the middle between you and your enemy, that person is always going to look closer to the enemy than to you. It's a kind of optical illusion. And I think that's a relevant comment here, because although China is indeed Russia's main trade partner, it is enabling Russia to a certain extent. It's not as close to Russia as NATO makes out. Now, China exports things that can be used in the war, sure, but let's remember American companies were making trucks in the Soviet Union during the Cold War, and every truck can be used to military purposes. And, you know, China does continue to stress the importance of respecting territorial integrity. So it's not as if China has openly supported Russia's war in Ukraine. And on the other hand, there are also signs of a certain coolness between China and North Korea for whatever reasons. So I don't really understand why NATO seems determined to make these three countries, Russia, China, and North Korea, close ranks, come closer together, when really the West should be doing all it can to drive a wedge between them, to push them further apart. But I think, unfortunately, closing ranks is going to be the reaction when the strongest military alliance in the world is treating those three countries already as if they were one monolithic bloc.
And staying with you, Dr. Myers, NATO is expanding partnerships with Indo-Pacific nations, including South Korea, and NATO Chief Stoltenberg said the alliance will initiate flagship projects with its IP4 partners. NATO members are also eyeing to conduct more joint military exercises with them. How big of a threat would this be to North Korea, and would this prompt the North to consider conducting joint drills with Russia?
Well, you know, the NATO Secretary General Jens Stoltenberg said the other day that what happened in Ukraine could happen in Asia tomorrow. And those are really quite strong words, especially if you regard the Ukraine conflict as the product of U.S. expansionism and provocation, which is how the North Koreans and the Russians look at it. They look at it very differently from the way we do. And of course, anything that tightens security cooperation between Japan and South Korea, as these proposed military exercises would inevitably do, is going to be perceived by Kim and Putin as an added threat. And Putin would see that, I think, as a de facto extension of NATO. If NATO were to work with the IP4 countries, he would see this as a de facto extension of NATO into a worldwide alliance, pretty much encircling Russia. Now, what nobody's talking about is the strong possibility of the South Korean government going back into left-wing hands at the next presidential election, which could well mean the end of Japanese-Korean military cooperation and a serious blow to this sort of cooperation that NATO is aspiring to. But in the meantime, I think, yes, I think Russia and North Korea will indeed be looking to conduct more joint exercises in response to this perceived threat.
And your argument is also echoed by many experts, many other experts here in Korea. They say that the North Korea-Russia Defense Pact stipulates joint measures for the purpose of boosting their defense capabilities, and this could open doors to the two countries' joint drills. Very concerning indeed. Professor Che, moving on to the Middle East. This year's NATO summit also invited Middle Eastern countries, but the war in Gaza was excluded from the official summit agenda. What were some notable remarks made by NATO leaders regarding the war?
So, as you said, during this NATO summit in Washington, D.C., the conflict in Gaza Strip was largely ignored. So NATO's joint statement didn't mention Gaza. And most leaders, including Joe Biden and also many European leaders, didn't address this issue. However, some leaders did speak out. So, for example, the Turkish President Tayyip Erdogan said that the NATO should not continue its partnership with Israel until there is a sustainable peace in Palestine. So he firmly stated that any cooperation attempts with Israel within NATO will not be supported by Turkey until this peace is realized. And there's another example, the Spanish Prime Minister Pedro Sanchez, and he urged NATO to apply the same unity and standards to the situation in Gaza as he has to Ukraine. So he mentioned, he said that there is a need to avoid double standards to maintain strong support for Ukraine, so calling for the same level of commitment to the peace in Gaza Strip. And also, President Joe Biden said something about Gaza war right after the end of this NATO summit during press conference. So he highlighted the importance of bringing home Israeli hostages and paving the way for peace and stability in the Middle East. And Biden also mentioned that ending the war wouldn't require Israel to stop targeting Hamas leadership. In other words, the Israeli leader and Prime Minister Netanyahu can still sanction Hamas leaders even after the conclusion of a ceasefire in Gaza Strip.
Now, Israel's expansion of its military operations into the West Bank and near Lebanon poses a dangerous escalation. Do you foresee the conflict in Gaza spreading to a wider regional war? And would the U.S. and the international community be able to prevent it?
That's a very challenging question. It's hard to predict the situation in the Middle East, but I think that Israeli expansion of its military activities into the West Bank and also near Lebanon is a serious escalation that could potentially widen the conflict. And actions by Israel might prompt a reaction from other groups and players in the Middle East, for example, Iran and also Hezbollah in Lebanon. That's why the Hezbollah's leader has recently stated that his group will only stop attacking Israel if Israel agrees to ceasefire in Gaza Strip. And also, there's another reason. In Israel, domestic politics could play an important role in shaping this conflict. The Prime Minister Netanyahu is under pressure from his citizens and also ultra-conservative politicians, which might push the situation towards further escalation. However, I believe that there are still some opportunities to prevent this escalation. Currently, I believe that neither Hezbollah nor Iran wants to start a new war in the Middle East. Hezbollah's role in its alliance with Iran is mainly to act as a deterrent against a potential Israeli or American attack, especially on Iranian homeland. For example, its nuclear facilities. In other words, what Hezbollah and Iran want is not a new regional war, but how to deter a potential invasion by Israel or America. And there's another reason, a broader regional war could also lead to some severe humanitarian disaster, which might trigger international intervention. So global powers and organizations like the UN could become more engaged to stop humanitarian disaster if a larger regional war breaks out. And this might also help prevent further escalation of the conflict.
Well, hopefully Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu will place peace before his political aspirations. And if I may add, the world is now facing the most dangerous security challenges since the Cold War. So we'll be sure to keep close tabs on the developments in the Indo-Pacific region as well as the Middle East. Thank you, as always, Professor Choi, for your valuable insights.
Thank you very much.
And many thanks to you as well, Professor Myers, for your brilliant analysis.
Thank you for having me.
And that brings us to the end of the show. Thank you for watching, and be sure to tune in same time tomorrow to join our conversation. Goodbye for now.